I will go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. Happy Earth Day. It's our 50th anniversary of Earth Day, and we're happy you could join us for this virtual celebration. So thank you for being here. We're celebrating our Virgin Islands National Park. We're celebrating St. John, St. Thomas, St. Croix, all of our Virgin Islands, and we're celebrating with you wherever you're at in the world. I'm Todd Samsel. I'm with the Friends of Virgin Islands National Park. And in a minute, I'll introduce our speaker for the session. First, I want to recognize and thank, we have several partners and sponsors that we're really looking forward to getting together with everybody here in Cruz Bay on Earth Day. But we're really appreciative of their support in helping us to bring it to you virtually. Our sponsors include Island Green Living Association, which we'll hear from later, Virgin Island Waste Management Authority, the U.S. Virgin Islands Department of Tourism, and our very own Virgin Islands National Park. U.S. Virgin Islands here on St. John and on St. Thomas are certainly blessed to have Virgin Islands National Park. And we're all working hard with the National Park Service staff that are here to make sure the park's ready to welcome you back as soon as we can. And so we're looking forward to that. Just a bit of housekeeping. If everyone could stay muted, that would be helpful. Feel free to type any questions in the chat that you may have, but otherwise we will have some time for question and answer after the presentation. Also, just a quick disclaimer, we are recording these presentations for later use. And so if you don't want to be on video, feel free to turn your video off. But otherwise, we'll assume we have your permission to show your lovely smiling face on our website and to classrooms in the future and things like that. So thank you. So our first Earth Day virtual seminar, Call of the Wild, and here to tell us about what we can learn from sounds in nature is the president of VI Wild, Dr. Renata Platenberg. Renata, thank you for joining us, and we're looking forward to hearing from you. And do I need to stop sharing so you can take over? Okay, there we go.
Good. Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us on this first talk, the first seminar of the day. My name is Renata Platenberg. I'm a wildlife biologist, and I've been in the Virgin Islands for about 16 years. I started with DPNR Fish and Wildlife before moving to the University of the Virgin Islands, and just recently I've started my own nonprofit to provide kind of a bridge between government and university, and with a focus on research and community education and outreach and citizen science. So today, I'm gonna be doing a lot of flipping back and forth between my screens, so hopefully we'll be able to keep track of, hopefully I'll be able to keep track. Hopefully you should be seeing Call of the Wild. Can you see that? Okay. So today we're going to be learning about sound and animal sounds and how we use those sounds to learn about wildlife. So first of all, I'm going to just play a little piece of sound for you, and I want you to listen carefully and kind of think about what it is. I'm not going to ask you to tell me what you're hearing, but think about what you're hearing and think about what it means. Like, what do you think that habitat looks like that we're listening to? Someone needs to mute because we're hearing you and not my sound. Can everybody make sure that you're on mute? Okay, I'm gonna try this again. Let me know if you cannot hear this. Oops, shoot. Already we're, all right. Hmm.
We're on like somebody else's meeting, I think. Is this Gift Hill School's Earth Day?
Hello, I'm sorry, do you have a question? Hello? Okay, so I'm gonna just move on, right? So what can everybody hear me?
No.
You cannot hear me. Kyla, you cannot hear
I can
me.
hear you fine. I can hear you fine.
Okay, can everybody please mute? Okay, so what you should have heard in that recording, which I don't think worked very well, but what you should have heard was a bunch of birds and maybe a frog. And what that recording, what I was hearing, what I can hear from that and how I interpret that sound is that, you know, there's birds calling. The birds are banana quits and hummingbirds and some thrushies. So it's telling me that there's a food resource close by. And also that it's during the day, right? And in fact, this is a photograph of of that habitat where I just took that recording. So the sounds that we're listening to can really tell us a lot about you know, our environment, including the kind of information about individual species that are hurt animals and animal populations, including their activity patterns, their distribution across the landscape, so where they are in relation to each other. We can learn about non-native species and where they are. We can learn about how species are associated with each other, who's in that community, and how they're using the habitat, and etc. There's a whole bunch of different pieces of information that we can get from these sounds. So how we record these sounds, we have these recorders, and we put them in the field, and this picture shows an acoustic recorder that we use to record the sounds of birds and frogs and bugs. And this one shows, it's almost the same, except it's got some elaborate microphone setups, and that's the ultrasonic recorders that takes recordings of bats, and I'll talk to you a lot more about that in a moment. So these recorders are expensive, right? So one of these is around $1,000, and the acoustic ones are a little bit cheaper because they don't have the elaborate microphone system. So it can be expensive to do this acoustic work, or it can be super cheap to do it because we all have cell phones and we can all use cell phones to collect these recordings. And the recordings are really, really high quality recordings off a cell phone. So the last couple of years, you might have been involved with a project about frogs, right? So cell phones. So I like frogs. I like frogs a lot. Frogs can, not only are they cute and cultural, iconic symbols of interesting things, and think about like Kermit the Frog and some other characters that we are familiar with. But frogs are really critical ecosystem service providers in that they do stuff in their environment that benefit us, like eating lots of bugs. And they also serve as really important ecosystem indicators because they're sensitive to environmental conditions. So if we see the frogs behaving, like if we see frog populations responding to something, then we know that, you know, if we see their populations changing, we know that they're responding to something that's going on in their environment. So something else that we love about frogs, you're probably familiar with this. If you live in the Virgin Islands, this is what it sounds like at night. Right, so frogs are pretty noisy, and we can use those sounds to tell us who they are. And a few years ago, in 2015, I started this great VI frog count project which is a citizen science project that involves local people going outside in the Virgin Islands with their cell phones to take recordings and map locations. And I'll just give you some results from this project. First of all, the first year that we did it, we got 317 recordings received from both the US and the British Virgin Islands. And each of these green dots represents a single recording that was submitted during that frog count project. We've done several iterations since then, the most recent one being in 2019. And it's a different style of map, but it shows the same thing. The purple dots are all showing where the distribution of the frog recordings were. So in 2019, we got just under 200 submissions. And again, from the British and the US Virgin Islands. And to date, we have recordings from 9 different islands. And what we get from these recordings is the location of where the frogs are. So each one of these dots represents a species ID. This one's orange, so this is the coqui, this one's the red-eyed coqui, this one's the whistling frog, and this one's the white-lipped frog. And we can see that these animals are distributed across this landscape in a different way to each other, right? And of course, the location of the recordings indicates where people are, where people have taken these recordings, but it doesn't matter that much that there's great gaping, holes in this data set, because we can still look at where these frogs are found and the differences in these species assemblages in these communities to identify some habitat use patterns. Right, so some other stuff that I heard in the recording, so I listened to each one of those recordings, right? Insects, dogs, people, traffic, 2 mosquitoes, a bat, right? So by putting all of these different recordings and these different pieces together, we can develop a monitorable soundscape of human impact. So what that means is that we can start associating these human sounds with animal animal presence and absence. Right, so from the frog count, if we go back to that first kind of slide that tells us about what we can gain from sound information, environmental sound, we can get all of these different pieces. So species, community, non-natives, distribution across the landscape, habitat use, but we can also get these, we can tease out these human influences, so responses to human activity. And because this is a citizen science project, we can also get some information on community interest and how people within the Virgin Islands community are engaging in conservation effort. So let me just talk you through the anatomy of sound, right? So we take those recordings, and like I said, I listen to them, but I also upload them into some sound analysis software. And this is what the software does for me. It plots the sound on a graph. So on the x-axis is the duration, is time. On the y-axis is frequency, right? And so this top graph is the amplitude of the sound, how big that sound is. And the bottom graph is the actual sound itself, the shape of the sound. So frequency and time, the duration of the different signatures of sound, and the size of the sound within this panel gives us these harmonics, these different harmonics. So this is the recording that I played for you at the beginning of this talk, and I'll play it for you again in a little bit. So we can take that sound, that what it's called a spectrogram, which is the graphical, the visual representation of sound, and we can break down those little pieces and identify species that are calling within those. So this sound signature belongs to this frog, this one belongs to this frog, and we can ask the software, we can train the software to look for these patterns, and we can process thousands and thousands of these sound recordings in a reasonably short amount of time. And by being able to look at it, it really helps, because this is what let me just go back. This is what this sounds like. So we're hearing a mosaic of sounds, and it can be really hard to listen to that and identify what it is that you're hearing. So the visuals really help us to pull those different pieces apart. Okay, so we know about frogs, we can hear frogs. What about bats? We know that we can't hear bats by just listening to them, by going out and listening to them. And I'll show you that again in a minute. But we know that bats do make sounds, and the sounds that they make are related to echolocation. So a bat will send out a signal. This is the signal that the bat is sending out in yellow. It's a call that the bat sends out. It will fly around sending out these calls. That's called echolocation. When the call from the bat hits something like an insect or a tree or a wall or something, it starts to bounce back. And the bat can identify how far away the sound is based on the amplitude and the frequency and the distance between the sound, the timing duration between these signals that's bouncing off. And the bats will respond by speeding up their sonar, or if it, in the case of a bug, so it can hone in on where it is, or the bat will fly away if it's something that it's about to crash into. And so I just want to just briefly say that the bats, a lot of people think that bats are blind because they have this echolocation, but in fact the echolocation enables them to navigate faster and more efficiently through cluttered environments. And they actually do have really good eyesight, but with the echolocation they're able to do what they're trying to do a lot faster and a lot easier. So, and then we can use these sound signatures again to identify the different species. So this call parameter belongs to this species, which is the fish-eating bat, and this sound signature belongs to this species, which is the Molossus molossus, or insect-eating bat. I'm gonna stop with the PowerPoint for now. And I'm going to go and stop sharing my screen for a second. And I'm going to go into my sound analysis software. Let me see, where is my screen? I'm going to go back into my soundware, and I'm going to show you and let you listen to some of these sounds. So here's this recording that I took outside. And hopefully you can see this, this graph with this very cluttered sound signature. And I'm just gonna play this for you. Hopefully you can hear it this time above the concrete truck that's driving outside. Okay, so I understand that it's not very loud, but hopefully you can hear some of that. We heard some threshies in there and some banana quits. And by listening to different pieces, let's just listen to this little piece right here. Right, so that's a chicken. So that sound signature is a chicken. We can verify by listening. Right, I heard a chicken again. And this guy here, I think, is a banana quit. And the chicken. So even in this mosaic of sound, we can start to see some of these patterns, and we can start to identify what it is that we're hearing in these recordings. And I'm going to go to a different recording. Let's see. I'm going to go to a bat. Oh, that's not the right one that I wanted to go to. Let me see. I haven't started sharing this yet. Feeding buzz. Okay. Oops. Sometimes it's hard to keep track of what screen I'm sharing and what screen I'm not sharing. Okay, let's see. Feeding buzz. There we go. Share. Okay, so what we're seeing now is a different pattern. This one's very clear without a whole lot of clutter in it. And if I play it at normal speed, what you're going to hear is a bunch of insects. So I'm just going to play this. Listen carefully. All right, so you heard a bunch of insects. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to slow it down to 1/16 of its regular of normal speed, right? So that was normal. That was real time, normal time. And I'm going to slow this recording down. Oops. So what we heard there, right? This is a Molossus, a Pallas mastiff bat, or a little insect-eating bat. And what we heard is this one bat flying along. It's flying along. It starts to detect something, and it sends out a different. It changes the pitch of its call while it's looking for what it detected, and it hones in right here. It starts to, it identifies that it's on the track of this insect, and it starts honing in on it until here it either loses the insect or it captures it, and then it continues on flying on its way. So this is what's known as a feeding buzz, and I'm just going to play that. I'm going to play that segment again for you because it's pretty cool. Okay, so in this recording, in this one recording alone, we can identify species. So it's Molossus. We have the time stamp and the date stamp. So we have the timing of the activity, what time of night this bat is doing this. We have day. We can associate the date and the time with some weather conditions. And we also have some behavioral. We know what this bat is doing. It's feeding. And in some of these recordings, we can also pick up some socialization calls between bats. We can pick up numbers of bats that are flying. And so if we, as I said, when we send out those recorders, we can pick up thousands of recordings in a single night. And by putting all of those together, we can start to get a really good picture of who our bats are and what they're doing. And I wanted to share with you one more little, recording, one more feeding buzz which has a bird in it, and it's pretty funny because, well, I think it's funny. Okay, so we're gonna listen to this recording and you're gonna hear a bird. So in that recording, we just heard the bird, but what we wouldn't have known if we didn't have this ability to capture ultrasonic sounds is that there's also a bat flying around. So if we just if we slow this down again, what we're gonna do is we're gonna turn that bird into a monster. And I'm just gonna listen to this little section here. Right, so by slowing that bird down, we made it sound like a whale or an elephant or some kind of scary thing. So we can have a lot of fun with these recordings as well. And finally, I showed you that picture of the Eleutherodactylus lentis. I'm gonna play you one last recording. Let me just look for that recording. So that's this guy. Share screen. Okay, so I'm gonna play this recording and we're gonna listen to a bunch of frogs here. So this is Eleutherodactylus antilensis. It's our red-eyed coqui. It's the frog that you're familiar with seeing it outside at night. We hear it all the time. In the Virgin Islands, we have this other frog called the mute frog. So called because biologists thought that it had no voice, that it was just out there and living by itself and living with its partners and not advertising its presence or territorial in any way, shape, or form. But in further research, we've discovered that this frog actually does have a voice. And the reason why it's very difficult to find this frog is because it doesn't act the same way that the other frogs do. It's active on the ground, in the vegetation, in more moist habitats. But it calls in the middle of the night when the other frogs aren't calling. So it's not in this acoustic mess of sound, in this mosaic of sound. It's actually calling during quieter periods. So I'm going to play this recording starting here. And there you have it. That is the voice of the mute frog, the frog that everybody thought didn't have a voice. You have just heard its voice. I'm going to play it one more time for you. Okay, so when you're out at night, in the middle of the night, when nobody else is calling, and you hear that sound, that bip, 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 you know that that sound belongs to this frog there, the mute frog. And it's endemic to the Virgin Islands. It's found nowhere else on Earth, and it's a very special little frog. So I want to thank you very much for coming to this seminar, and I'm happy to take any questions. And if you want more information about what we do at VI Wild, you can like us on Facebook, and you can contact me for more information. And that's a wrap, folks.
I have a question.
Yes.
Hi, I live in Fish Bay, and the only thing you hear at night is nature. After a heavy rain is when we hear the tree frogs. But when it's dry like now, it's very quiet.
Yeah, so our frogs are, they're adapted to moist environments that don't have standing fresh water. So you're familiar with the fact that we have a dry season here in the Virgin Islands. So from kind of summer, we get first kind of typical year, we get first rainfall in April, end of April, beginning of May. And then you get sporadic rainfall through the summer and higher humidity. And then you have the rainy season in October, September through November. And so our frogs they time their activity based on those rainy seasons, because in the States and in Europe and in other, temperate areas, the frogs will come out in the early spring, they'll migrate to a breeding site, and they'll spawn, they'll engage in courtship and lots of calling, and they'll spawn, they'll lay their eggs in the water, and then the tadpoles will develop into frogs, and then at the end of the summer, the metamorphosed little froglets will move out and spend the winter on land. We have a different system here because we don't have ponds and we don't have reliable standing water. And so what we get are, the frogs are direct developers. They're adapted to this environment where there's not a lot of standing water. And so they will breed in the rainy season, and they produce eggs. And the eggs are not in water. They're in the trees or on the ground. And one of the parents guards the eggs and keeps them moist. And the tadpoles develop inside the frog eggs to hatch out of the egg as a little tiny frog. And so they're very, very tied in their activity, their reproductive activity, which is what triggers the calling, is very tied to the moist season. So I hear a lot of people say, oh, my frogs are gone. I don't have any frogs. And it's like, well, when was the last time they heard your frogs? And they'll say December. And you come May, June, July, those frogs will start calling again. That's why you don't hear them in the spring.
Somebody's asking about their pool getting filled with frog eggs, though.
Yeah, so the pool that gets filled, so the frogs that lay eggs in the pools are non-native frogs. Those are the Cuban tree frogs, or sometimes the frogs, it's the toads, the cane toads on St. Croix. They'll use those more deeper sources of water. We have as many cane toads on St. John or even St. Thomas as St. Croix or other places. But these animals are non-native, invasive, and they can be problematic to our native wildlife. Yeah, any other questions?
Renata, hi, Pamela.
Hi, Pamela, how are you?
I'm good, how are you? First of all, shout out to Renata. She is amazing. She came in and did a presentation for our teachers at Eco Schools and really got them fired up. So we're lucky to have her here today. I have a question about these dratted Cuban tree frogs, which, as I had told you, are visitors into our pool and incredibly noisy. How are they detrimental to our indigenous frogs? What do they do to upset the balance?
Yeah, so our native frogs, what I didn't show you in those pictures, but our native frogs are all about, you know, yay big, right? You can see they're all brown jobbies, about the size of half of my thumb, except for the whistling frog, which is about the size of my thumbnail. Our native frogs are very, very small and highly adapted to their environment. The Cuban tree frogs, on the other hand, are the size of my palm, right? They're giant and they have big mouths, and they will eat whatever they can fit into their mouths. So they'll eat our native frogs, they'll eat our non-native frogs, they'll eat deer, they'll eat lizards, they'll eat, you know, baby birds, they'll eat just whatever they can, you know, capture and consume. And so when there's just a few of them, it's not really huge problem. But the past years, we've had a lot more kind of standing water, and those animals have done really well in standing water. And after the storm, they just proliferated. So we now have, we are now picking up the Cuban tree frogs in our frog count recordings, and they are now everywhere. And when you have a lot of them, then they just start causing, you just start seeing native species declines as a result.
So do you recommend that we as a community try to deal with them? I mean, what's...
Yes. So that's a challenge, because they really are too many to really eradicate or control. And what I would recommend is, if you have standing water and you hear the frogs, I heard one this morning, they sound like rah, rah, rah. When you hear that, you want to go out and get rid of standing water so that you don't get them laying eggs in buckets and things like that. You know, you can get rid of the eggs. Getting rid of tadpoles is a little bit more problematic, because it's just not recommended to you know, to torture them by throwing them on the ground. Right? You have to think about humane eradication of these things. So eggs are really easy to control. Once they turn into adults, they're much more difficult.
Renata,
I have one more question.
Can you talk about the time of year that you do the frog count?
Yeah, so we do the frog count to coincide with the peak of the frog activity season. So they start to be active in the summer. They are really active during the rainy months of September, October, and November. And so we time our frog count to coincide with that peak in the first 2 weeks of October. And we do send out the notification via Facebook and social media, so keep an eye out for that. I'm a little bit late in processing the recordings from last year, and I haven't done it yet, but I'm working on it. It's last week. Next week is the last week of classes at UVI, so I'll have a lot more time to really sit down and do that stuff.
I have one more question.
Yes.
For today's meeting, I found this frog almost jumped on me last night. What?
Yeah, that looks like a Cuban. Yeah, that's a Cuban tree frog. Yeah. So I didn't even need to see the picture. When you said jumped, I knew exactly what frog it was, because the Cuban tree frogs are the leapers. They're the ones that leap from tree to tree. Our native frogs kind of scuttle around and maybe hop a little bit, but they don't do those big long distance leaps that the Cuban tree frogs do. Yeah.
He's just hanging out.
Yeah.
Any other questions for Renata?
No, but just thank you.
Hi, Doreen. Thank you very much for coming. And
Sure.
Doreen is one of our amazing frog count volunteers. She drives around and takes a lot of recordings from different locations on St. Thomas. So thanks so much for that, Doreen.
That's great. And if there's other folks that are interested in more
welcome.
information on volunteering or taking recordings, we can certainly help get that word out. I just want to thank you, Renata, for doing this, for kicking off our virtual Earth Day. I want to thank everybody for joining us. If you're planning on hitting any of the other seminars later in the day, we'll see you again. It's a different link. You should have gotten that when you registered. But if there's no other questions, we can sign off, and happy Earth Day, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Happy Earth Day.
All right.
Okay, Todd, I'm going to leave. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you, Renata. It was wonderful. Appreciate it. And we'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, thanks so much. Bye,
All
Mom.
right. Bye-bye.